My name is Zane Richer, and welcome to Cornerstone's 3322 project, where we'll explore America's Christian heritage and invite you to help us ensure her godly legacy. The great church father Tertullian once famously asked, "What hath Athens to do with Jerusalem?" In this question, he hoped to propel the early church to consider the age-old question of faith and reason. Or in other words, what does the church, which is here symbolized by Jerusalem, have to do with the academy, which is here represented by Athens, which was the seat of all learning and philosophy in the ancient world? And as we look around us today and examine the crumbling edifice of contemporary Western thought, it is becoming very much evident that that same basic need, which was recognized by those early saints of the first century, the need to actually articulate a compelling and rigorously scriptural vision, not just of the church within its own walls, but of how that church should interact with all of the other institutions of life, becomes desperately needed. In this video, we'll do what we can to address that fundamental question, but with a special focus this time, not on the academy, but on the state. Because whether we like it or not, politics has become an increasingly ubiquitous presence in the modern life. It's expanding into areas we would never have imagined. And this, after all, only makes sense. It's one of the oldest and gravest scriptural warnings that whenever men reject God, they will look to idols to give themselves a basis for meaning and for living and for justifying their definitions of authority. And without God at the helm, the state, as a prominent locus of power in the world, becomes a very natural substitute. In other words, it becomes a very formidable idol. Now, does that mean that the government itself is evil? Well, certainly a Christian would not say so, any more than an idolized job or spouse or child is evil. Such things a Christian believes only become destructive when they usurp the place of supreme worship, which is reserved to God alone. It's not wrong that they should be loved, as St. Augustine would tell us, but that they should be loved disproportionately. And so, as with most idols of the heart, the key to protecting ourselves and our neighbors from this worship of the state is not to cease loving it, and certainly not to begin hating it, but simply to put it back in its proper place, letting it neither possess the throne of heaven nor the gates of hell. As Lewis says, it ceases to be a demon the moment it ceases to be a god. And in the words of Herbert Schlossberg, we raise it up out of the pit when we take it down off the altar. Thus, our objective becomes singularly clear. We must return the state to its rightful and God-ordained context in the modern life. But this, of course, faces us with a question, one which modernity and certainly post-modernity have been increasingly ill-equipped to answer, and one with which the church must answer if it wishes to go on having any credibility whatsoever to speak into the lives of modern people with modern problems who, whether we like it or not, are saturated in politics. And that question is this: what is the proper context of the civil government? What is its place? What is its nature and its function and its purview? And the good news here is that Christianity has a rich, vibrant, and robust tradition of answering these questions compellingly. A tradition which America itself was born out of, as we'll discuss further in later videos. The intellectual arsenal is ready and waiting. The bad news is that the church seems largely to have forgotten about it. So, in order to rediscover this deep thought, let's begin by opening our Bibles and looking at what exactly God has to say about this institution of civil government. Let's begin with definitions. When most people think about government, their first impulse is to picture someplace like Washington, D.C., somewhere with bustling lawmakers and legislation and elections and all kinds of white column buildings. But to the Christian, we realize that that is not the first level of government, nor is it even the most important. In its most comprehensive sense, government, as defined by Noah Webster in his 1828 dictionary, is merely the direction or regulation of certain conduct or behavior by a legitimate authority. When we understand it in this light, we begin to see that every minute decision we make from day to day involves some aspect of government. When we choose to go left instead of right at the fork in the road, we exercise direction in our lives. When we decide to go out to the gym instead of out for ice cream, we demonstrate regulation of our bodies and our appetites. When we study for long hours, we exhibit government of our mental conduct. Thus, the question becomes not whether a certain feature of life will or will not be governed. Everything is governed by something, and it always will be. We will never be without government, not in this age, not in the one to come. Rather, the question is, by what will we be governed? In order to answer this, we must discover what is the first and preeminent level of all government from which all the others derive themselves. And this, of course, if we're looking at our Bibles, is not difficult to find. According to the scriptures, if we open the book of Genesis, God himself created the heavens and the earth, and thus he retains sovereign authority to dispose and direct them as he chooses. The very picture of God resting over creation on the seventh day is a statement of supreme authority. Just as a painter has a right to govern which colors go where on his canvas, or a writer gets to choose which words follow which on the page, God, by virtue of his creatorship, possesses the first and ultimate level of all government over all creation. The prophet Isaiah, and our theme verse for this project, reinforces this by informing us that the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king. Thus, he possesses in entirety the three natures of government in one person, those being the legislative, executive, and judicial. And in the New Testament, Christ himself is even presented as the one to whom the winds and the waves obey, indicating to us that his government is not only over the conduct of men, but over the entire conduct of nature itself. His is the first supreme level of government. There is not one atom or galaxy in creation, not one thought in the head or feeling in the heart of men, that he does not claim absolute and sovereign right to control. But that raises a question for us. How is it that anyone else, including us here on earth, come to exercise any of it at all? The answer here is simple, but profoundly important. The reason why people can exercise authority is because God has given it to them. We don't have it on our own. God has to delegate it to us. And this happens in the first chapter of Genesis in the 28th verse, which says, "And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth." This has been called the dominion mandate by theologians, and it deputized man to act with God's authority as stewards or regents on the earth in order to better exhibit their nature as bearers of his image. Importantly, this mandate is accompanied both with tremendous liberty, but also within a framework of law to direct it productively. You see, no sooner had man been given governance over himself and over the earth, but he's placed under a solemn obligation to use that authority righteously instead of unrighteously. We're going to talk about this a lot more in the coming videos, because this much has not changed, not even with the fall. This has made it more difficult, impossible even without the help of the Holy Spirit, but we still have the same obligation. Thus, when a Christian thinks of government, his first impulse must be to acknowledge the supreme governance of God over the whole creation. And secondarily to this, he must acknowledge the righteous self-government of individual man over himself and over nature. Importantly, at this point in the Genesis narrative, the civil government, the public law, hasn't even entered the picture. God has not yet given any man authority over any other. This happens later, after the fall and after the flood. So as we proceed into the pre-flood era, we find that mankind has become so intoxicated with sin, and since there is no external or civil law to bind the excess of his vices, the level of violence and destruction and wickedness has become so great that God himself is even pictured as repenting for ever having made him. God destroys the world in a flood, but preserves Noah and his family alive, and landing them on Ararat, seals them with a covenant. And in this covenant, God will now require something new. He will require a reckoning for certain high crimes, such as murder, to be exacted from man by man, saying, "Whosoever sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man." This is important. In so doing, God has here delegated certain men authority over the lives and over the liberties of others in the case of great crimes. This is the beginning of the civil power, the original charter, as it were, and by it we learn several important lessons about its nature. First among these is that the institution of civil government is God's merciful solution to the lawlessness of sin. It is instated in order to preserve liberty, order, and justice in an intensely fallen age. This makes very good sense of what Paul later articulates in his famous letter to the Romans, when he describes the civil magistrate as ministers of God to thee for good. Governments, of course, can go bad. There's no question on that, and their going bad can be horrific insofar as the power they wield is great. But the Christian must always remember that even a very bad government, such as Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon or Nero's Rome, is, in the words of the apostle, instituted of God for his purposes, and it is better than the horrors of lawlessness. This is all the more confirmed by the instruction of the prophet Jeremiah to the exiles in Babylon to seek the welfare of Babylon and to pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. Thus we come to the first great truth of all proper understanding when it comes to the state, that the civil government is an institution ordained of God for the purpose of preserving a tremendous liberty, order, and justice in a fallen world, and it wields real authority on the earth to accomplish this purpose. It is not, however, the only institution of authority on earth. It exists coordinately and is designed to function harmoniously with several other spheres of government, such as the church and the family and the individual self-government, which we already talked about. In other words, it is part of God's good design for human civilization, but it is only part. We must not think of the civil sphere as the single arena of government in life, for that would be idolatry. It is a vital sphere for the proper functioning of society, but it is only one of many, and it is the duty of the Christian to redeem all of these spheres, so that all might fulfill the purpose for which all things were created, which is to proclaim the glory of God in the whole of life. That, to begin with, is what Washington has to do with Jerusalem.